So this morning, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our purpose in life, just in a certain specific sense. You know, if you ask somebody or somebody asked you what your purpose in life or your goals were, I guess it partly depends on the context. Like, let's say your boss at work asked you what your goals were. You might think in terms of your work. And I want to talk about work this morning when if you ask the average unbeliever what his goals were related to finances and work and everything, I think theirs would be something along the lines of, well, I'd like to basically, in my generation, they would have said something probably like, I'd like to enjoy the American dream. Now, that was kind of the phrase that kind of encapsulated, a nice home in the suburbs maybe, and lots of nice things and a good job and life being good. And I think today, one thing I hear more, and I don't know what you think people would say, but I hear people just talking about, well, I want to be happy, or I hear people say they want their kids to be happy. And that's certainly not a bad thing at all. One thing I've found is I see that being the desire a lot of times people have is that's a pretty elusive goal. And sometimes the very things that we do to try to attain that maybe work against us. So related to that, one thing that Peter says about that whole way of looking at things and just trying to accumulate things to make ourselves be happy is he kind of describes it as the feudal way of life inherited from our forefathers. And that's true. That's kind of the way things are in this world today. And really, as believers, I guess one thing I wanted to think about this morning is that we tend to fall into that same trap. I mean, we're Americans. We live in a country of abundance. We have the opportunity to enjoy a lot of nice things. And I think it's easy for that to become an end in itself, and just to enjoy life here as much as we can. And if we're not careful, we can just kind of push spiritual things to the side to a large degree. And it's interesting, though, the Lord really presents that contrast to, and basically the idea of we can have one master or the other. We can either serve God or we can serve money. And also that where our treasure is, there will our heart be also. So there's clearly a battle going on there for our attention and for our affection. And what the Lord wants for us, though, is related to spiritual things. And Paul really kind of describes this a lot. And I want to talk this morning, a lot of the things I want to share about this whole topic are things that Paul either has to say or maybe things that were an example that he lived in his life. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:9 there that our ambition is to be pleasing to the Lord. And so in his terms, what he's thinking of is, in terms of a goal or ambition, is related to accomplishing spiritual things. And even related to maybe our occupation or what we should be busy about. He talks about later in that same chapter that we are ambassadors for Christ. That's really a role that we have, even if we don't even think about that. We are ambassadors for Christ, and we can either do that very faithfully or not so well. We think about some of the ambassadors that have probably served the United States, and some have done a really great job, and some maybe that you can even think of haven't done a very good job at all. But we can be the same way and related to the Lord and what we do. So one thing that kind of got me thinking about some of these things, although I've kind of gone down a little bit different path since then, is when Baron Flock was here recently, he said something about, I think he asked the question, are you a missionary? And kind of made the point, we're all missionaries, along that same lines of that ambassador idea. And whether we realize it or not, we're all missionaries. And at some point, I think I'd like to look at that a little bit more, not so much today. But a lot of us would think, well, I have a full-time job. I mean, I'm kind of busy. And it's a valid point. And I wanted to think of this morning then and kind of focus on, well, how does our job and what we do for a vocation really tie in with what the Lord wants us to be doing? Are they kind of opposed to each other to where you just always have to kind of deny one so that you can do the other? Or does the Lord intend for them to be something that complement each other? Another verse I thought was interesting there in 1 Corinthians 16:15, Paul's talking about work that he's involved in spiritual work. And I thought it was interesting the way he says that phrase, the work. Everyone who helps in the work and labors. And I thought, that's true. Our work, our jobs are work, but the Lord's work is the work. If you want to think about it that way, that's the thing that we want to elevate to the top. And they aren't meant to conflict. I think sometimes we put things in conflict in our lives that don't need to be. Everything that the Lord has asked us to do, whether it's our jobs or our family or any other responsibility that we have that's God-given, are not in conflict with each other. The Lord would not have done that. He has created these things to all work together, and often part of that is blending them together and accomplishing more than one thing at the same time to some degree. So, but there are some things about work, and I just thought I'd start with, what are some of the things that the Word of God says about work? I mean, is that really a valid thing? Should we be working? There in 2 Thessalonians 3, it says, basically, if anyone is not willing to work, he shouldn't eat either. And so Paul is challenging people. He says, now such persons we command and exhort in the Lord Jesus to work in quiet fashion and eat their own bread. We should provide for ourselves. We should provide for our families too, which is kind of seen a little bit there in 1 Timothy chapter 5, that if anyone doesn't provide for his own, then he's denied the faith and worse than an infidel, or an unbeliever, as it says there. And just again, that idea that work is something that God has ordained. It's not, even though our jobs may have no inherent spiritual part to them, it's something the Lord has us to be doing. And so again, how are we going to blend that with what we know his spiritual goals for us to be? Another goal he has for us is not only to provide for ourselves and for our families, but to be able to provide for other people and to share with people. And that doesn't necessarily imply, so you need to make quite a bit more. Part of that is, again, an attitude of being ready to share, as opposed to necessarily, I have enough, I can share, whereas, I don't really have that much, so I can't share. Obviously, it's more of an attitude than it is how much funds we would have. Another thing that a fundamental thing about work that the Lord shares with us and is quoted more than once in the New Testament is this idea that we don't need to be focused on our livelihood or our vocation to the point where, hey, that's what consumes us. The Lord wants us to be focused on, because you can only really focus on one thing as a priority. He wants us to focus on spiritual things. And he promises, you focus on what I'd like you to focus on, and I'll take care of those other areas. And that's hard for us to do. I mean, naturally speaking, it's like, well, yeah, but don't I need to still go? I mean, we're involved in that. So, I mean, again, it comes down to developing a confidence that the things that the world would say, this makes sense, you really got to do that if you're going to make more money or if you're going to have a good career, to be able to say, yeah, but I don't see that helping spiritually. And I don't see the Lord leading me to do that. And I want to trust him that that'll be okay. And so I think a lot of this just comes down to, what are some individual decisions that we make along the way to honor the Lord and to elevate spiritual things. And then that last verse, whatever you do your work heartily as to the Lord and rather than for men. And this would be true in our vocation as well as any other thing. And again, what men appreciates like what maybe your boss would appreciate may not be the same thing as what the Lord appreciates. And sometimes you may have to choose one or the other to obviously we need to, obviously with our bosses, we have responsibilities and fulfill the roles that they have for us. But at the same time, it may be that along the way, we do things a little differently because we want to please the Lord. And certainly pleasing your boss is part of pleasing the Lord to a certain degree. But again, sometimes there's a challenge there to blend those two things. And so this morning, I just wanted to look a little bit about some different situations and stages of life, maybe where we have decisions to make, and maybe, well, what does the scripture have to say about that? And what should be our mindset as we go through those things? And, I have some personal experiences, but that's, one person's experiences are obviously pretty limited sample. The Apostle Paul, again, talks about these things a lot to other people, as well as because of the book of Acts, we have a little bit of insight into his life as well. So there's some things that we'll look at there as well. So the first area I wanted to look at really is that of, let's say you're a high school senior and you're trying to figure out, well, what am I going to do with my life? Don't you love it when you're a high school senior and everybody comes and says, oh, what are you going to do next year? And all of a sudden, okay, well, I guess I better figure that out. And it's a valid question, right? And hopefully, as a believer, the question comes to your mind, well, what does the Lord want me to do? That should be a thought that comes to our minds, right? And as we think about what we are going to prepare for a life work, it's an important decision. We're going to be spending a lot of time at our jobs, right? And I think it's important to some degree that we enjoy our jobs to a certain amount, that it's a good fit for us, because if it's not really a good fit, we're probably not going to be very happy doing it, and probably going to make it harder to fulfill the things the Lord wants for us along the way as well, if we're really struggling at that. So we want it to be something that's a good fit. We might, your school counselor is going to ask you or talk to you about, are you good at math and science? Well, maybe you might want to consider engineering. Or you're more creative, maybe you want to pursue a vocation in art or in some more creative field. My son Eric is an interior designer, and that fit him more. So each person's different. And along the way, you may have enjoyed doing some different things. Like, let's say you enjoyed working at camp, and you might think, well, I'd really love to have a job where I could have my summers off so I could work at camp. And so you think, well, maybe I should be a teacher. Well, is that a good fit for you? To teach, and Benaiah could probably, or Stephanie, or different ones could probably share with us this. You don't want to do that just, let's say, so you can have your summers off if you hate doing it. And so again, it needs to be a good fit. And the Lord, again, use all of those things together. So if he really wants you to have your summers off, for example, then the Lord can help you find a job that'll allow that. And then again, we have to be careful that does the Lord want me to have the summers off, or is that just something I kind of like doing? And we have to be honest about some of those things, as especially if we're seeking the Lord's help, we want him to lead us the way he wants to lead us, not just the way that kind of is something that I'd like to do. Just as we think about preparation for that degree, let's say, again, you're a high school senior, you're going to think about, okay, well, where should I go to get preparation for that? Whether it's college or a trade school or whatever, do you need to go to the place that has the best program for that? That's how some people choose. It's like, oh, well, that's the top school for that thing in my area, so that's where I'm going to go. Not necessarily. You don't need to go to MIT to become an engineer. I graduated with another kid from school who did that. And I think he liked going there, and he was happy with that choice, but he's not a believer either. I ended up going to Wichita State, pretty average school for engineering. And Yet they trained me to be an engineer. Oddly enough, it still worked. And that's true, I think, for most things. So I guess I would just want to challenge, we don't have to follow the same path and the same line of thinking that the world does. There might be other things, there are other things that should help drive our decisions instead. So for example, when I went up to Wichita, and I think I would encourage any young person who's thinking about where to go for that extra training, there was an assembly up there that was working with young people at the time. In fact, they had a program for young men, a discipleship program. And I wasn't going to be part of that directly, but I thought, you know what, I can take advantage of some of that as a student there. And so that's kind of how the Lord got me thinking about going to Wichita. And I really benefited from those years. And I don't mind that I didn't go to MIT, and I don't mind not having the student loans for that either. But so anyway, I think we should think about what kind of preparation is that going to be. So, and you might think, well, does it really matter where you go for a few years? You're just there for like 4 years, maybe 2 or 4 years, depending on what you're pursuing. Well, I would look at it this way. You're preparing for the rest of your vocational life during those years at school, right? That's a pretty big deal. Are you not preparing for the rest of your spiritual life as well? During those 4 years, are you going to just kind of opt out and work on preparing for a vocation and kind of set spiritual things to the side? Well, if you do, then you're not preparing for the rest of your life spiritually either. And the Lord has already told us that's what he cares about. So I would look at, when I choose where to go to school, hey, how's the Lord going to use that to develop me spiritually to be able to serve him? And okay, good. There's a school here too that offers what I think is a good fit for me vocationally. Yeah, why not? I think that's a valid way to approach it as a believer. So there are a lot of things that are important as we think about making those choices. And, it might be different than what maybe the rest of your family always went to this certain school. So you've always thought, well, that's probably what I'll do too. Maybe that's not what the Lord has for you. It's good to stop and think about what would be a good fit. I think about going back to Paul, the Apostle Paul. He went down to Jerusalem shortly after he was saved. The Lord didn't keep him there and let him train under the apostles. And you'd think, well, it seemed like that would have made sense, right? And especially given the magnitude of the role that he was going to have in the early church. But the Lord didn't do that. It sounds like from references he makes that he learned a lot just out in the desert in Arabia or in other more remote places. The Lord had a different plan for him. So anyway, all that just to say that the Lord may surprise us and it may be different than what we thought. So it's good to think about it and not just kind of assume, okay, well, this seems like the default or easy decision to make. And another thing to think about is, and this is a valid question, especially for a young believer, is, well, if spiritual things are more important, should I even work a secular job? Shouldn't I just serve the Lord? And, I think that's a valid question. That makes sense in that sense. And the Lord leads people along that lines too, from a very young age sometimes, to be more directly involved in spiritual work. But the Lord's timing is often different than ours too. Often the Lord is going to use our experiences in living the same kind of life that everyone else does to develop in us the opportunity then and be ready to go into a service that might take more time. That lets us develop, that lets other people see that, hey, here in our own local assembly, that person has had an effective ministry of evangelism, or that person's had an effective ministry of discipleship, or different things. And as the Lord gives them a burden to maybe go do some other kind of ministry, you think, you know what? Yeah, I see the Lord's done that. And we can encourage them in that. So in terms of career choice, I would say I don't see full-time Christian work being a career choice. It's something that happens as a result of the Lord using us in such a way that there comes a point where we can't hold down a job and fulfill the spiritual ministry that the Lord has for us both, and it becomes a necessity. So it's good to think in terms of how can the Lord use me, and at the same time always be focused on the more the Lord wants me to use me spiritually, the better. And if that's full time, that's wonderful. And I think maybe more of us should think more in terms of being willing to do that than we do. So just shifting gears a little bit, and I don't know if I've missed some of those verses or not, but when let's say we're done with school and now we're thinking about, okay, where should I get a job? And again, we're faced with some of those same questions about location and how the Lord would want to use us in a certain kind of ministry. And again, it might be different than you think or maybe thought you wanted. When I finished school in Wichita, as I said, I'd had a really good experience and enjoyed the fellowship of the believers there. There was a nice group of young adults that I was really enjoying being part of and with. And when I went to interview with the company I ended up going to work for, actually, I got the opportunity to choose what location. They interviewed us for 4 different locations and told us at the end of it, hey, tell us which one would be your preference. And one of them was Wichita. And I went into that thinking, Wichita would be my first choice. And I don't know at what point the Lord started to change my thinking about that. It wasn't necessarily right during that time. But one of the other choices was Tulsa, to come back here. And through different things, the Lord just started to caused me to think, you know what? I think the Lord really would prefer I go back to Tulsa. I see that more of a need there. I don't know exactly how he wants to use me, but I really sensed the Lord wanted me to go back to Tulsa. So again, it was different than what I originally thought or thought I wanted at the time. And the Lord was good. At first, and I'm told lots of people this before, but first week I was back, started my first job is the week that Fred Clarkover moved to Tulsa. And he was a big encouragement. And again, I saw that specifically at the time as confirmation that, if you make choices based on wanting to honor me, I can fill in the things that are hard or the things that you thought you were giving up even sometimes. And so that was a real encouragement to me. And then, so I started working that job, and during those younger years, I worked for that company for about 10 years. And it was toward the end of those 10 years, I had a boss who said to me one day, and I don't know if what started the conversation, but he said, Dan, these are your wealth building years. And I'll never forget him using that phrase. I don't know if that's a common phrase or not, but these are your wealth building years. I was in my early 30s. And his point was, you need to really maximize this time. You need to be, and I was in a sales role, so I had opportunity to maybe put more into it to accomplish more and to make more money. And I think he's right in the sense that, like, that's a time when you have more energy and more opportunity, and you're up for doing things. You're more motivated, maybe. But the other side of that is that's true for spiritual things as well. Those are also your wealth building years for spiritual things. And it always comes back to, wait a minute, I can't really focus and do both, can I? I have to choose one to really focus on. And the Lord Jesus himself talks about storing up treasures in heaven. He says, it's a waste to store up exorbitant things here on earth or to make that your focus. Store up treasure in heaven instead. And it's a choice just that we have to make. So again, I guess what I want to encourage you this morning is just to think through these things. I mean, again, your experience is going to be different than mine. I'm not trying to say, hey, do what I did, because there's a lot of things I never even faced that you probably face. But let's think through, but what's the Lord's perspective on that? You know, when somebody says something like that to us and is trying to maybe motivate us a certain direction, some things to consider in our work. You know, you might have a job that you might want to work that doesn't occupy your mind all the time. One thing I've liked about my job over the years is that I can be fully there when I'm at work, and partly that's why I like to actually work at my office. And when I go home, I'm home. And there's not really a lot of crossover. And that has been useful for spiritual things, to be able to not have to constantly be drawn into things one way or the other. That's been my experience. That's been useful. You might want to work a job with less hours to free up more time for ministry. Obviously, just like focus, time is an issue. Every hour we spend working our secular jobs is an hour we don't have available for either our families or for ministry. I mean, that's just a math equation right there, you know. So that's something to think about. Sometimes we might be tempted to think, well, if I made more money, maybe I could give more. But I think that's really a trap that Satan would really promote. I don't know if you've noticed, but the Lord doesn't need any money. He has what he needs. And you might think, well, yeah, Dan, but I'm aware of all these ministries that seem to be struggling. True. Will you making more money solve that? Probably not. So I think we just have to be realistic as our mindset again. What the Lord wants more than our money is us and our time and our focus. And, you know, if we have a job that allows us to easily incorporate ministry and our work together, either because our job's flexible or maybe our job might be ministry related, that's great too. If that's what the Lord has for us, again, that's a possibility. I think about Paul and what he was willing to do. It's interesting if you think about when he was unsaved and he was pursuing the Christians, like during Stephen's time. And he was a Pharisee. He was a leader. He was somebody who was prominent. I think he was building prominence and had the potential to be one of the chief leaders in Jerusalem, probably. And then he got saved, and that changed everything. He couldn't do that anymore. And he worked as a tent maker to provide for his daily needs. You ever think about how humbling that would be for somebody like Paul to now just be making tents to provide for his daily needs? Well, that's a pretty big drop. But for him, what did he say about it? He says, what things were gained to me, those things I counted loss for the sake of Christ. And it was okay. He didn't care about all that. And we know that he had a lot going for him in terms of the world. But that was his conclusion. Another area to consider as we think about this whole area is related to marriage. Decisions we have to make about marriage. It says in Ecclesiastes 4 there that two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. And that's really true. And you think about from a ministry standpoint, there's a lot of things that a couple can do that a single person really can't do. And that's a very good thing. Now, critical in that is that our spiritual goals be aligned. If a couple is not aligned in what they want to accomplish, then they're not going to be able to accomplish very much. So that's certainly important that we get on the same page, and sooner the better on that. You know, that's probably really something that needs to be thought through before a person ever gets married. So if you're a single person and you're thinking about, hey, I'd like to serve the Lord, who you marry is critical to that. And do they feel the same way? Do they care about spiritual things too? And do they understand the importance that you see about spiritual things? Also, there's the the practical side of just thinking about what a married couple can do, I think about how you can kind of focus on multiple things at the same time. Again, there's this idea of whether you're full-time or not. Well, I was working a full-time secular job, but my wife is available for other things. And so we've got this opportunity to accomplish a lot of different things with that partnership. My wife didn't need to work a full-time job. She's not a single person who has to provide for herself. So as a result, she was able to help with a lot of background things, preparation things, and us go a lot further in different ministries. We helped in Explorers Club and Youth Group and Teen Retreat and Vessels of Honor and Sooner Bible Camp and Ozark Family Camp, a lot of different things. And you know what? We couldn't have done that if Kimberly hadn't been free to help with those things. And so it was a very valuable thing that the Lord used to allow us to be involved in ministry as a result of that. And, as a married couple too, stage of life is going to be an issue. There's some things that you may not be able to do as much when your kids are little, but maybe more as they get older. And I would just encourage you to do what you can now. It doesn't need to be all or nothing about what we're involved in for the Lord. Let's do what we can and incorporate again the Lord's work and activity into what we're doing as a family. And that'll help train your children as well as allow you to be involved in more ministry. So again, you're not having to kind of pit one against the other. Should I spend time with my family or should I spend time with the Lord and his people? Do them together and maximize the use of your time that way. And if you're a single person, there's some things that you can do as a single person. You have more freedom in some ways that married people don't have. And so, again, don't just think, okay, well, when I get married, I'll get all serious about spiritual things or whatever. Take advantage of that time you have and use it. Maximize that time because the Lord has given you that particular opportunity as a single person. Some of the other things to think about then related to, again, going back to our jobs is when there's maybe we need or think there should be a change to be made. How do you decide, whether to make a change? Should I change jobs? Should I maybe change location? Should I stay where I'm at or move to a different place? I think somebody who's maybe saved at a later age is just kind of thrown into the middle of this. They never thought about where to go to school based on what the Lord would want or where to go to their first job or whatever. Let's say they're 40 years old and they come to know the Lord. Well, what are they going to do? Well, Paul would say, and maybe I think I've got this, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead. I press on. You can't do anything about some mistakes you've made. And that would not just be true for an unsaved person, but it would be true for all of us as believers too. I can think of choices I made that I wish I'd done differently, and I'm sure you can too. Well, some of that we can't go back and undo. It's just part of the past. And so the Lord would encourage us, just, okay, look forward. What do we need to do now in the situation that we're in now? What can we do to be most effective for the Lord today? And I think one of the things is has to do with along the lines of stability and contentment is I think if you're not sure if the Lord wants you to make a change, then I think that's a good indication that it's probably not quite the right time. Don't just make a change because you kind of feel antsy. You can stay and stay where you're at and continue in that until the Lord gives you clear direction on something. Otherwise, I think you're likely to make a choice that you later regret or realize that wasn't wise. So I think you can just remain in that condition, which you recall. This was an interesting verse that I found that Paul's talking to slaves and says to them to remain in the condition in which they were called. Thought, wow, talk about being content to not feel like, hey, I've got to change something or I can't really serve the Lord. And that can be true for us too. And we need to be content. The Lord told soldiers that asked him about what they should do when they were responding to his call for repentance. And one of the things he told them was be content with your wages. I don't know if they had good wages or not, but that would be a testimony. They could be content with their wages. And Paul encourages Timothy to be content with food and clothing. And it's like, seriously, if we think about it, are we really content with that? And our tendency would be to not. But again, in terms of if we want to make ourselves available to be used by the Lord, then we've got to be willing to be content with less than what, let's say, our unsaved coworkers are pursuing, or what the world around us. And really, here I think the focus isn't on how much we have, but it's the attitude of contentment that the Lord wants. And as it said back in 1 Corinthians 7, even related to talking to slaves, says there, if you're able also to become free, rather do that. If you have an opportunity that the Lord brings, go ahead and do that. So it's not that we can't change anything or that the Lord might not change things, but again, the focus would be if the Lord provides something. I think about Joseph and Daniel in captivity, really, both of them, and how the Lord elevated them to a really high position in those different countries they were in. But it wasn't something that they were pursuing. They weren't working their way up and kind of figuring out, okay, I'm gonna do this so I'll get noticed, and then I'll move to that next slot, and then I'll move to that slot. That wasn't their preoccupation. They were just serving the Lord, doing a good job. And the Lord took them and used them at a certain level. So sometimes that happens. But it needs to be what the Lord does. And as far as making changes, sometimes we really don't know. So I think it's good to ask the Lord. And when we ask the Lord, stop and listen for an answer. We might be tempted to think, well, I should pray about that. So we pray about it. Well, honestly, did we stop and listen to see, what's the Lord saying? Maybe one way the Lord to speak to us is through wise counsel. Obviously, if you're married, are you and your spouse in agreement? That would be important. Sometimes there's times when you need to make a job change. Maybe at your workplace, they're asking you to do something that's wrong, either just unethical or illegal or whatever. Well, you may not be able to stay in that situation. As a believer, you can't do that. You might wake up one day and haven't been thinking about these things, haven't been really living for the Lord, and realize, hey, I want to, and maybe there's something about your work situation that is going to hinder that. And you feel like, you know what, I just need a fresh start. I need to go somewhere where I can just start fresh and be a testimony for the Lord. And maybe the Lord will be in that. I remember when I left my first job, I was feeling very discontent. I kind of found myself just becoming kind of a griper and, not a really good testimony. And I thought, this isn't a good situation. I know this isn't good. And the Lord provided another opportunity. And so that I felt like that the Lord was really in that. One thing as you think about leaving a job, I could encourage you to make sure you're a good testimony. Don't leave on bad terms. And sometimes that's not completely in your power, but to the degree that it depends on you, make sure you're a good testimony while you're at wherever you're at, and that you try to leave on good terms so that the Lord, again, can use that for good in people's lives. Okay. So, and then thinking about maybe the idea of relocating, just some thoughts about that. Sometimes a move that the Lord would have you might involve relocating. And again, I would say don't just do that to do that. But if the Lord shows you someplace that maybe gives you a burden to go help out somewhere, and it involves a change of location. Well, if that's of the Lord, then that's a good thing. I think about when Barnabas went to Antioch, and there was so much opportunity and people getting saved, and the need for discipleship. And he thinks about Paul that he had met in Jerusalem, and he goes to Tarsus and finds Paul and says, "Hey, why don't you come help there in Antioch?" And apparently the Lord convinced Paul that was the thing he should do. And so he came and had a very productive ministry there as a result. I think about 25 years ago when the Hellers were burdened about helping out starting a New Testament fellowship in Little Rock, and then Phil and Martha as well. And they uprooted their lives and went and did that. And so that was a pretty big deal. But the Lord can be in that. Maybe the Lord has you needing to relocate to take care of that family member, like we looked at earlier, was a responsibility we have. I know Becky came back from France. One of the main reasons was to take care of Dad. Again, there can be some really good reasons. And as we think through those things, what's the Lord want here? And again, sometimes you might think, well, how's that going to work vocationally? Or how am I going to sell my house? Or how am I going to do this or that? And I think the Lord can give us peace that if that's what he wants us to do, then he'll take care of that. It'll be fine. If we're thinking about relocating, we have to be careful that we're doing it for the Lord, though. So, maybe you're thinking, you know what, I've always really wanted to live near the beach, which is nothing wrong with living near the beach necessarily. But if that's the main thing you're considering when you're thinking about relocating, that might not be what the Lord has for you. And here's the thing, if the Lord wants you near a beach, he can put you near a beach. And so it's not like, again, you might be surprised, I think, when you decide to honor the Lord in how you make your decision, that he gives you something that you were hoping for anyway. But not necessarily. And that has to be okay. What about the issue of more money? I think I hear so often when people talk about, and this is more true among unbelievers, but it's true of believers too sometimes, is you find out that they've got a new job. And, why are you making the change? Well, it's more money. Okay. Is that how the Lord leads us? More money? I would suggest it's almost always not the way that he'd lead us. Now, that's, again, don't feel guilty if you take a job that has more money, but that shouldn't be the reason why a believer would change jobs, and certainly not move to a different location and uproot their relationships and all that because there's more money. That's how the world thinks. So again, that side of it is a secondary thing. We want to be thinking in terms of what's the Lord wanting to do? And so especially if I'm going to go to a new location, do I see the Lord having a ministry for me there that is a clear leading? And you know what? Okay, I found a job there, and yeah, it's a great job. That's nice. But let's make our decisions about those things to be about spiritual things. And then just finally, as we kind of wrap up our careers, you get toward retirement, and I must admit, I think about this a lot more than I used to. And again, for all of us, whether we are at that point or we know we're going to be at that point sometime, I think it's good to think about, how am I going to use that time? You will probably have more time in retirement to be involved directly in spiritual things than you do when you're working a job. But it's not guaranteed that we'll do that. We all know from our own lives, from whether it was summer vacation or Christmas break or whenever we've had some free time, we don't just automatically use those effectively, right? And I think the same is going to be true for our retirement years. If we haven't been involved in the Lord's work while we've been in our work years, you're probably not going to be either very involved or very effective in ministry in your retirement years? How would you be? What do you have to offer that the Lord hasn't built that into your life? So again, that would just be an encouragement to don't even think, well, I'm busy right now, but one day when I retire, that's when I'll really give my time to the Lord. That's again, I think a lie of Satan. That's not the way it'll be. And I'm not saying that there's never been anyone who was really, really busy and then they served the Lord during retirement years. But you know what I'm saying? In general, that mindset is not accurate spiritually. So again, we want to be thinking in terms of preparing for that. And, you know, it's funny when you think about retirement financially, you know, somebody will tell you, hey, the sooner you start putting away money for retirement, the more it'll grow and the better off you'll be. It's true in spiritual things too. The sooner you start and the more consistent you are, the more that will result in spiritual good. And it's amazing. Every area you look at and it's like, wow, they're both kind of true. And you realize, but you've really got to decide which one to focus on more. You know, an older believer, we can't do the same things when we get older as when we were younger. I know there's certain things that I can't really do that I used to do, and that's okay. The Lord's just made that as seasons of life, I think. And, you know, I've heard older people say before maybe things like, well, all I can do now is pray. Well, one, that'd be good. And two, anything else you might have done, would it be more effective? Would it be better? I mean, that's up to the Lord. So again, there's always going to be something that we can do, but we want to build patterns so that we're encouraged to keep doing things for the Lord, whatever stage of life that we're in. And, you know, just, I was just thinking about this whole, and you might think if you're younger, wow, we're talking about long ways here. Life goes by pretty fast. You know, next year I'll have been out of college for 40 years. And that seems just like 40 years. How did that happen? But it went by pretty fast. And so I guess that's my encouragement to you to think about these things, whatever stage of life you're at, because time will go by fast and you'll realize I didn't really use that very well for the Lord if you don't make a specific plan. So you want to do that. And, you know, everyone's situation is different. I can't make decisions for you. And I wouldn't do a good job if I tried. But we can just encourage each other to, again, put a priority on the Lord's things in all these decisions that we make in life. And again, you've got this whole world out there around you that has a different mindset. They're not going to be encouraging you to spend your time for the Lord. And they're not going to understand people at your work, your neighbors, your family, your unsaved family. They aren't going to understand this. And so that's going to be kind of hard sometimes. But we want to honor the Lord first of all. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to raise these things and think about, you know, am I investing for eternity now? And if maybe as you think through this, you think about something in your own life that you think, you know what, I really need to do something different there. And it's maybe something completely different than I ever even thought of when the Lord prompted me to speak about this. But I would just encourage us, think about these things. And if we need to make a change or think about things differently, then let's do that, because we want to prioritize the Lord's things and accomplish things that will last for eternity. So it's really my encouragement to us all this morning.